A man in worn boots walked into Gordon Ramsay's most exclusive restaurant, only to be treated like trash and shoved into the shadows. The staff thought he didn't belong, until one voice changed everything. And when Gordon Ramsay himself stepped out of the kitchen, the entire room froze. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The night air in Beverly Hills shimmered like it had been painted with gold dust. Streetlights glowed against polished marble storefronts, and luxury cars idled at the curb like trophies on display. Outside Hell's Gold, Gordon Ramsay's flagship restaurant, the scene looked less like dinner service and more like the opening night of a film premiere. Paparazzi lenses snapped and flashed, capturing socialites in diamond-studded gowns and executives in sleek, tailored suits as they swept past the velvet ropes. Influencers posed dramatically under the restaurant's illuminated sign, their laughter high and practiced, their movements carefully choreographed for the eyes of the world. Hell's Gold wasn't just a restaurant. It was a performance. The red velvet rope separated the hopeful onlookers from those deemed worthy to cross into its carefully guarded interior. Guests handed keys to valet drivers as if they were transferring royal treasures. Rolls-Royces gleamed under the light. A silver Ferrari hummed as it pulled into the driveway, its driver stepping out with the quiet pride of someone who knew they belonged in this world of excess. Every detail outside had been staged to whisper one thing: exclusivity. Inside, the atmosphere elevated that promise. Crystal chandeliers hung like constellations above tables draped in ivory linen. A live string quartet played near the bar, each note threading seamlessly into the soft hum of conversations. Waiters, in pressed black uniforms, glided across the room, carrying plates that looked more like art than meals. The aroma of truffle risotto and seared scallops lingered in the air, rich and indulgent, mingling with the faint sweetness of champagne corks being popped at the center lounge. Diners leaned into one another, voices hushed but charged, every table a theater of power, wealth, or influence. It was a cathedral of indulgence. Every flicker of candlelight seemed timed. Every glass gleamed like crystal, pulled from a dream. To sit inside Hell's Gold was to declare yourself part of the chosen few. Those who didn't simply eat, but curated experiences the rest of the world could only imagine. And then, through the grand glass doors, a figure stepped in who disrupted the illusion entirely. No entourage followed him, no stylist had dressed him. His boots were worn, softened by years of use. His jacket hung loosely, faded at the seams but cared for with quiet tenderness. Over one shoulder, he carried a weathered satchel that had clearly traveled more miles than most of the Ferraris parked outside. His face was calm, his posture unhurried. Keanu Reeves had entered Hell's Gold. The doors closed behind him, and for a fleeting second, the energy in the room shifted. The quartet kept playing, the waiters kept moving, but a ripple of subtle glances swept across the dining floor. Some noticed him immediately, others didn't. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. In a sea of tuxedos, silk gowns, and polished leather shoes, Keanu's presence seemed almost out of place, like a monk walking through a palace of indulgence. He moved with quiet confidence, the kind that needed no announcement. His eyes took in the chandeliers, the flickering candles, the grandeur of the open kitchen where flames leapt from copper pans. He wasn't gawking, he wasn't dazzled. He observed, steady and still, as though he had seen splendor before and knew that behind every shine there was a shadow. The hostess stand gleamed in the center, manned by staff who carried the same rehearsed smiles they'd perfected for nights like this. But before he could reach it, a few diners had already started whispering. A man in a dark suit leaned toward his companion. "Who lets someone dressed like that in here?" he murmured. His date glanced, then shrugged. "Probably lost," she said. At a nearby table, however, a woman's eyes lingered longer. She adjusted her pearl necklace and tilted her head. There was something unmistakable about his features, even in the dim light. But she kept her voice low, unwilling to break the spell of her own carefully curated evening. Keanu seemed unaffected by the eyes on him. His boots made no sound against the polished floor, his jacket catching the glow of golden light in a way that softened rather than diminished him. He walked as though time itself slowed around him, each step deliberate, neither hesitant nor demanding. The servers at the bar paused briefly, unsure whether to intercept or ignore him. He gave them a gentle nod, an acknowledgement that carried neither need nor apology, and continued toward the front. His satchel shifted slightly as he moved, the strap worn but sturdy, a detail unnoticed by most, but telling of the man himself, someone who carried what mattered, not what impressed. By the time he reached the center of the room, conversation had resumed in full. The laughter of moguls, the clinking of glasses, the whispers of critics filled the air again. But a faint awareness lingered like smoke in the background, the awareness that someone entirely different had just stepped into their world. The maitre d' glanced up from his leather-bound reservation book, expecting another guest wrapped in designer couture. Instead, his eyes landed on Keanu. For the briefest moment, his practiced smile faltered, though he quickly recovered. This was Beverly Hills, after all, and appearances always came first. Behind Keanu, the glass doors opened again to admit a pair of socialites who swept in wearing glittering gowns. Paparazzi flashes spilled briefly into the room before the doors closed once more. Attention shifted back to the spectacle of luxury. Yet, even amid the buzz of arrivals, Keanu's presence seemed to leave an invisible mark, like ink soaking into parchment. The chandeliers sparkled overhead. Waiters carried plates where microgreens had been placed with surgical precision. At the center lounge, champagne flowed into crystal flutes with effortless grace. Every detail screamed refinement, exclusivity, excess. And in the middle of it, Keanu stood with his weathered boots, his faded jacket, his satchel resting against his shoulder. He didn't fidget. He didn't apologize. He simply waited, his stillness louder than all the chatter surrounding him. It was this composure that unsettled those who noticed him. The polished guests of Hell's Gold were accustomed to people striving, pushing, demanding a seat at the table. But here was a man who asked for nothing and carried himself as if he already belonged without saying a word. Somewhere near the bar, a young influencer raised her phone to capture a video of the dining room. Her lens swept briefly across Keanu before she turned it back to her flaming lobster tail, unaware of the story about to unfold. At that moment, a waitress with a slick bun and crimson lipstick spotted him from across the floor. Her name was Chloe, and her gaze sharpened instantly. To her, the restaurant's brand was everything. Presentation was perfection, and this man with his quiet presence and unpolished clothes looked like a flaw in the masterpiece she believed she was helping to protect. She smoothed her apron, adjusted her smile into something polite but cutting, and stepped forward, heels clicking like punctuation marks against the marble floor. Before Keanu could even greet the hostess stand, Chloe intercepted him. Her eyes flicked over his boots, his jacket, his satchel. Her smile never reached her eyes. And in a voice honeyed with false sweetness, she said, "Excuse me, sir. I think you might have taken a wrong turn. This is Hell's Gold." Chloe had been at Hell's Gold for only 6 months, but in her mind, she was already part of its brand. Everything about her was curated to match the restaurant's aura of perfection. Her hair, pulled back into a flawless bun, never allowed a strand out of place. Her crimson lipstick was bold but deliberate, the kind of detail that made her feel in control. Even the way she walked, heels clicking in rhythmic precision, was a performance, each step rehearsed for power. She had worked her way into this world with determination, telling herself that every detail mattered. In her view, serving food was secondary. Protecting the restaurant's image, aligning herself with its exclusivity, that was the real work. Tonight, she had already served glasses of vintage champagne to Hollywood executives, adjusted napkins for influencers, live streaming their meals, and laughed with the ease of a seasoned professional at the sharp jokes of tech moguls. She felt in her element. And then she saw him. Keanu Reeves, though few realized it yet, stood quietly at the entrance, his jacket worn, his boots softened by years, his satchel draped casually over his shoulder. To Chloe, none of that mattered, because she didn't recognize him. All she saw was someone who didn't look like he belonged in the carefully polished dream she believed she was part of. She narrowed her eyes, assessing him the way she'd been trained to assess glassware, posture, even the sparkle of jewelry. In her mind, he was a problem, a disruption to the brand. Someone who would bring whispers of judgment, maybe even threaten the illusion of perfection Hell's Gold sold to its elite patrons. She didn't pause to wonder why he carried himself with such calm, or why his eyes didn't dart nervously like so many others she'd dismissed. All she saw was that his clothes weren't tailored, his shoes weren't polished, and he carried no aura of wealth. Chloe adjusted her apron and decided quickly. She wouldn't let him near the hostess stand. If she intercepted him, controlled the interaction, she could keep the image intact. With a smile that looked polished but brittle, she crossed the floor, weaving past tables of diners without hesitation. She intercepted him just before he reached the stand, blocking his path with practiced grace. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone layered with condescension. "This is Hell's Gold. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Keanu paused, not out of offense, but with the kind of quiet stillness that often unsettled people who relied on control. His gaze met hers steady, calm, without a hint of irritation. He didn't rush to answer, nor did he allow her tone to unsettle him. After a moment, he spoke with a voice as gentle as a soft rainfall. "I'd like a table," he said simply. Chloe blinked, caught off guard by the absence of defensiveness. Most people she confronted in that tone either bristled or retreated. But he did neither. He was too calm, too grounded. She quickly regained her composure and let out a small, practiced laugh. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," she replied smoothly, though it was a lie. The restaurant had several open tables, and she knew it. She wanted him gone, or at the very least hidden. "It's a very exclusive evening, you see. We have quite a list of dignitaries and influencers joining us." "I understand," Keanu said, his tone unshaken. "I won't take long. I'm not here for attention, just dinner." The sincerity in his voice gave her pause, but only for a moment. She tilted her head, studying him as if she were examining an art piece she didn't appreciate. She wanted to make sure he understood that she was in control of this interaction, not him. Finally, with a sigh that was more theatrical than genuine, she relented. "All right," she said, her voice dripping with false benevolence. "I suppose we might be able to find a seat. Follow me." She didn't lead him toward the glittering heart of the dining room, where chandeliers glowed and guests posed for photos. She didn't offer him a seat near the open kitchen, where flames and artistry combined to impress the room. Instead, she guided him to the farthest corner, near the back exit. The table was dimly lit, half hidden by a potted plant that had seen better days. The uneven tile made the table wobble, and the air smelled faintly of detergent from the service corridor nearby. "This should be comfortable for you," she said, letting the menu drop onto the table with a dull thud. Keanu glanced around briefly, then gave a small, faint smile. "It's perfect, thank you." Chloe didn't reply. She spun on her heel, her mind already shifting back to her VIP guests. As she walked away, she muttered under her breath, "People will do anything to feel important." The chair creaked slightly as Keanu lowered himself into it. The sound swallowed almost instantly by the steady hum of chatter from the rest of the restaurant. His table wobbled on its uneven base, the faintest tremor running through the glass of water that had been set there without ceremony. It wasn't the kind of place a guest would choose. It was where someone was placed when a message was being delivered. "You don't belong." Just beyond the ficus plant that shielded half the view, the splendor of Hell's Gold unfolded like a stage production. Chandeliers sparkled with practiced brilliance. Crystal glasses clinked in time with the quartet's melody, and soft candlelight traced shadows across the polished marble floor. Every detail glowed with curated perfection. Yet here, at the edge of the spectacle, the air smelled faintly of cleaning solution from the swinging door that led into the dish pit. Each time it opened, clattering plates, shouted orders, and the hiss of steam cut briefly into the carefully composed music of the dining room before being swallowed again. Keanu didn't flinch. He slipped the weathered satchel from his shoulder, setting it carefully against the chair leg. His jacket, faded but neatly folded, he placed across the back of the seat with deliberate care. There was nothing hurried in his movements. Each gesture was thoughtful, unbothered by the imbalance between where he sat and the grandeur that stretched just feet away. To the patrons in the main dining space, he might as well have been invisible. At a table near the center, two moguls laughed loudly over a bottle of wine older than most of the staff. An influencer with diamond-studded nails held her phone high to capture a perfect angle of herself sipping champagne, the flash bouncing against her sequined gown. A couple of food bloggers in tailored suits dissected the plating of their scallops as though critiquing a painting. For them, Hell's Gold was a cathedral of prestige, and the man sitting in the corner didn't exist within that narrative. But if anyone had looked closer, they would have seen a different kind of presence. Keanu wasn't restless. His fingers didn't tap, his posture didn't shift impatiently. He didn't crane his neck searching for service or glare when Chloe ignored him. Instead, he sat quietly, eyes observing with a subtle gravity that made the air around him feel heavier, more deliberate. He wasn't dazzled by the chandeliers or unnerved by the whispers. His gaze took in the smallest details, the curled edge of the menu, the flicker of candlelight across the marble, the brief smile of the pianist as she played in the far corner. Chloe didn't glance back once. She was busy curating her performance, laughing with a group of tech executives at one table, adjusting the placement of a producer's napkin at another. She leaned in too close, her perfume trailing like punctuation behind her words, her smile reserved for those she believed deserved it. To her, the man in the corner was already forgotten, dismissed as a footnote in a night, meant for bigger names. But not everyone was fooled. At the far end of the dining room, an older gentleman in a navy pocket square noticed the exchange. Charles Holloway, a respected critic with decades of experience, had watched the way Chloe intercepted Keanu at the entrance, the tone in her voice, the way she guided him deliberately to the worst seat. He didn't know who the man was, not yet, but what he did recognize was composure, grace under fire, a rare stillness that didn't crumble in the face of arrogance. He made a mental note. Something was unfolding, and it would be worth paying attention. Meanwhile, Keanu opened the menu, his hand brushing lightly across the paper. He studied it with the same attentiveness someone else might reserve for an ancient manuscript. Not hurried, not distracted, but fully present. His expression betrayed nothing, no frustration, no unease. If anything, there was a faint trace of a smile at the corner of his lips, as though even in this neglected corner he found something quietly meaningful. And though the dining room carried on, glittering and loud, Keanu Reeves sat at the edge of it all, watching, waiting, silent, but not invisible. The table that Chloe had chosen for Keanu could hardly be called part of the dining room. It sat in a forgotten corner near the swinging exit door, tucked between a wilting ficus and a service station stacked with half-polished glasses. Every few seconds, the door would fly open with a rush of clattering trays, hurried footsteps, and the scent of soap from the dish pit. The noise broke the rhythm of the string quartet, clashing against the carefully orchestrated harmony of Hell's Gold. A broken tile beneath the table leg made the surface wobble with each subtle movement. The chair groaned as if it had been pulled out of retirement for the sole purpose of punishing unwanted guests. Above, a narrow light fixture flickered irregularly, casting shadows that stretched and snapped with every buzz. It was the kind of seat chosen when the message was clear: you don't belong here. The contrast with the rest of the restaurant was staggering. 20 feet away, the main dining area glowed with golden brilliance. Guests sipped champagne as waiters carved truffle shavings tableside. The chandeliers glittered like constellations, and the music of the quartet soared over the conversations of the wealthy and influential. Every gesture in the center of the room had been choreographed for spectacle, every plate presented like a jewel. But here, in the dim corner, Keanu sat as though none of it mattered. He leaned back slightly, folding his jacket neatly across the back of the chair. His satchel rested at his feet, the leather worn smooth from years of travel. He didn't shift uncomfortably or glance around impatiently. Instead, his eyes traced the edges of the room, observing the details others ignored. The way the candlelight reflected off a champagne flute, the concentration of the pianist's hands as she played in the corner, the quick glance a junior waiter cast his way before being called back to the bar. Chloe, meanwhile, made a point of ignoring him. She drifted between tables with her usual performance polish, pouring wine for an influencer couple, laughing at the sharp remarks of a film producer, and flashing her rehearsed smile at a critic she recognized from a magazine spread. Yet every so often, her eyes flicked toward the corner, and every time, what she saw unnerved her. Keanu hadn't moved. He hadn't complained. He simply sat in stillness, patient, present, as though he had been expecting the worst seat in the house all along. The longer Keanu sat there, the more the contrast became impossible to ignore. In the central lounge, laughter spilled like champagne, loud and self-assured. Waiters in sharp uniforms glided through the aisles with trays balanced high, their movements polished like dancers in a ballet. Plates landed before guests with flourishes, lobster tails ignited in flame, steaks crowned with edible gold, risottos perfumed with white truffle. Every detail was a performance designed to impress. But the corner where Keanu sat was stripped of that theater. The light above his table buzzed every few seconds, flashing shadows across his face in uneven strokes. A server carrying a tub of cutlery paused at the utility station beside him, clattering forks and knives onto a tray with no thought for the man seated just feet away. The door to the dish pit swung open again and again, releasing bursts of chaos that smelled faintly of bleach and boiled water. None of it seemed to touch him. Chloe watched from the floor, her smile glued in place as she poured a vintage Bordeaux for a pair of executives. Yet her eyes betrayed her restlessness, darting toward the corner whenever she thought no one noticed. She had expected impatience, tapping fingers, shifting posture, maybe even a complaint whispered to the hostess. That would have confirmed her assumption that the man didn't belong here, that he lacked the refinement for a place like Hell's Gold. Instead, his composure only deepened. Keanu studied the menu as though each word had weight. He traced the grain of the paper with one finger, not hurried, not restless, simply present. When the broken tile caused the table to wobble, he steadied it gently with his hand, then released it without frustration. Even the flickering light overhead didn't provoke a grimace. His calm was unsettling not because it was quiet, but because it refused to break. At a nearby table, a woman in a pearl gown leaned closer to her partner. She had been watching him too, her curiosity growing with each passing moment. "That man in the corner?" she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of the quartet. "Doesn't he look familiar?" Her partner glanced, then shook his head dismissively. "He looks like someone who can't afford this place." The woman didn't reply, but her eyes lingered on Keanu. Something about the way he carried himself told her this wasn't a man out of his depth. This was a man who knew exactly where he was and didn't need to prove it. Minutes slipped by, and the imbalance of the room grew starker. Guests at the center tables laughed, toasted, and shared stories over courses that arrived in flawless rhythm. Their dishes were presented with precision, garnished with gold flakes, and poured sauces so delicate they looked like brushstrokes on porcelain. Meanwhile, at the back, Keanu's table remained bare except for the menu and a half-filled glass of still water that had splashed onto the surface and left droplets running down the wood. No one hurried to wipe it. No one noticed at all. Yet Keanu noticed everything. He watched the servers darting in and out of the kitchen, their arms stacked with plates, their brows damp with effort. He noticed the pianist's small smile when she struck a perfect chord, though no one else acknowledged her. He even noticed the hesitation of a young server, Mia, who glanced toward his table more than once before returning to her assigned duties. He gave her a faint nod of reassurance. When their eyes met, as though to say, "I'm fine." Chloe, on the other hand, was not fine. From her station near the bar, she kept glancing toward him, irritation gnawing at her. His silence was louder than complaints would have been. Most guests who felt slighted showed it through sighs, gestures, or sharp words. But Keanu's stillness offered her nothing to push against. It left her feeling exposed, as though she were performing cruelty without an audience to validate it. She busied herself by lavishing attention on other tables. She laughed loudly at the jokes of two tech moguls, posed for a quick selfie with a film influencer, and poured wine with a grace so exaggerated it bordered on theatrical. Each gesture was a shield, a way of convincing herself that the man in the corner didn't matter, but deep down, she knew he did. Charles Holloway, the critic seated near the center, noticed too. His trained eye caught the imbalance instantly, the way the back table wobbled, the flickering light, the neglect that no respectable restaurant should allow. More than that, he noticed the man himself. The posture, the calm, the way he absorbed the environment without letting it bruise him. Holloway leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. He didn't know yet who the man was, but he knew this much. Hell's Gold was about to learn something it hadn't planned for. Keanu, still seated in the shadows, lifted his glass and took a slow sip of water. He set it down gently on the uneven table, as though every movement carried its own quiet weight. Chloe approached Keanu's table again, though not with the grace she displayed at the center of the room. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile, her steps stiff with irritation she barely concealed. In her hand, she carried a glass pitcher of water, droplets running down its neck, condensation smudging against her palm. When she reached his table, she set the pitcher down with a dull thud, the sound jarring against the delicate chords of the quartet. She filled his glass quickly, the stream splashing onto the table and dripping down the side of the glass. A few droplets spread into uneven circles across the wood. Chloe noticed, of course, but she made no move to wipe them away. "Would you like still or sparkling?" she asked, her tone clipped and formal, as if she were addressing a child. "Still is fine, thank you," Keanu replied, his voice calm, unbothered by the spill. She nodded once, lips pursed into something that looked like a smile, but felt like a smirk. Leaning in just slightly, her voice dropped into a whisper meant only for him. "Just so we're clear, there's a dress code here, usually enforced." Her eyes swept over his boots, his faded jacket, and the worn strap of his satchel. The judgment in her gaze was unmistakable. Keanu glanced down briefly at his clothes, then back up at her with the same even composure. He didn't bristle, didn't defend himself. He only nodded once, his words as steady as his gaze. "I'll keep that in mind." Chloe straightened, disappointed by the lack of reaction. She had expected at least a flicker of embarrassment, a flustered apology, something she could chalk up to her authority. But his stillness gave her nothing. It was as if her words had dissolved in the air between them, leaving her more unsettled than him. She turned away sharply, eager to find reassurance in the adoration of her favored tables. Just steps away, a pair of VIP guests waved her over. They were regulars, an entertainment. Lawyer and his wife, elegant in a pearl-white gown that shimmered beneath the chandelier. Chloe's entire demeanor shifted as she approached them. She poured their wine with a flourish, adjusted a napkin with delicate precision, and leaned in to laugh warmly at a joke. Her movements, which had been stiff and careless at Keanu's table, were now fluid, practiced, almost theatrical. Meanwhile, the couple watched her leave, then leaned closer to one another. The woman tilted her head toward the corner, her eyes narrowing in curiosity. "Isn't that Keanu Reeves?" she whispered. The man beside her adjusted his glasses and followed her gaze toward the dim corner. He squinted for a long moment, then shook his head. "Can't be. Why would he be sitting back there, dressed like that? If it were him, the whole room would know." The woman's eyes lingered, her intuition not so easily dismissed. She had seen enough of the industry to recognize a presence that didn't need a spotlight. The posture, the calm, the quiet dignity, it all felt unmistakable. "I'm telling you," she whispered, "that's him. But look at how she's treating him." At another table, a pair of food bloggers were filming their plates with meticulous care. Their voices carried across the room, their commentary focused on every garnish and drizzle. But even they paused briefly when their camera panned and caught the man in the corner, sitting in stillness. One of them muttered, "Strange choice for seating, huh?" before brushing it off and returning to their performance. Chloe, however, gave none of these whispers attention. To her, they didn't matter as long as she maintained control. She flitted between her prize tables like a performer moving across a stage. She poured champagne with a flourish, laid bread baskets down with the grace of a magician presenting a trick, and positioned herself perfectly in the glow of chandeliers. Her laughter rang a little too loudly, her posture sharpened into angles of elegance whenever she thought someone was watching. But whenever her eyes drifted back toward the corner, that still figure unsettled her. He didn't fidget, didn't call for her attention, didn't seem bothered by the noise of clattering dishes behind him or the uneven table beneath his glass. He simply sat, patient and composed, as though he had chosen that exact seat on purpose. The calm irritated her more than complaint would have. If he had demanded better service, she could have dismissed him as entitled. If he had shown discomfort, she could have confirmed her belief that he didn't belong. But his quiet presence left her with nothing to push against. It made her own disdain stand out, visible even to herself. Still, she buried the discomfort beneath layers of performance. With every passing table, she smiled wider, laughed louder, her energy growing more exaggerated as though to drown out the silent weight sitting in the back. The woman in the pearl gown sipped her wine, eyes still fixed on the corner. "If it is him," she murmured, "someone's making a mistake they'll regret." As the evening unfolded, the imbalance grew sharper. In the glittering center of the room, Chloe bent low to whisper suggestions for wine pairings, her tone velvety and reverent. She guided guests through menus with the care of a storyteller, weaving tales of imported truffles and heritage cattle as though every dish carried the weight of legend. She laughed brightly, touched shoulders lightly, and leaned close enough to seem indispensable. Every move she made reinforced her belief that she was part of the brand itself. Yet in the shadows of Table 19, Keanu Reeves sat untouched by her performance. His glass was filled only once, drops of water still staining the surface of the table. The breadbasket that had made its way to every other guest had not reached him. Even the flickering light above his head seemed to emphasize the neglect, its uneven glow casting him alternately into shadow and harsh clarity. Keanu, however, appeared unchanged. He traced the edge of the menu with a single finger, glanced occasionally toward the quartet as their music softened into a Debussy prelude, and even nodded once toward the pianist when she looked up nervously and met his gaze. His stillness radiated more strength than the carefully curated energy of the rest of the room. A younger server, named Mia, noticed. Passing by with a tray of appetizers, she slowed briefly near his table. Her eyes flicked from the wobbling chair to the water spots on the table, then back to his calm expression. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then caught sight of Chloe watching her from across the floor and hurried on, but the unease lingered in her chest. Meanwhile, whispers grew. The couple in the pearl gown spoke more urgently now. "I'm certain," the woman insisted. "That's Keanu Reeves. Look how he sits, how he doesn't demand a thing. That's exactly who he island." Her husband frowned, uneasy. "If you're right, then this place is about to have a scandal on its hands." But Chloe, still moving from table to table, refused to see it. Her laughter rang like crystal, her back turned deliberately toward the corner as though ignoring the man would erase him. What she didn't realize was that the very act of pretending he wasn't there was beginning to draw more eyes in his direction. The quiet man in worn boots was no longer invisible. His stillness had begun to speak louder than her performance. Chloe returned to the corner table at last, her notepad in hand, though her stance made it clear she would rather be anywhere else. She leaned slightly on the table, forcing the uneven leg to rock under her weight, the gesture almost deliberate. Her pen hovered above the page, her smile thin and insincere. "Have you decided, sir?" she asked, her tone laced with a kind of politeness that carried more disdain than courtesy. Keanu looked up from the menu, his eyes calm, his demeanor unchanged from the moment he had walked in. "Yes," he said evenly. "I'd like the Royal Beef Wellington, please." For the first time, Chloe faltered. Her brows lifted, her pen paused, and then a small laugh escaped her before she caught herself. "The Wellington?" she repeated, her voice slow, as if clarifying a misunderstanding. "Just so you're aware, that dish is $420. That's before sides and before service." The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled challenge. At nearby tables, a few ears perked up. One of the food bloggers raised his head slightly, glancing toward the corner, intrigued by the unusual sharpness in Chloe's tone. The woman in the pearl gown leaned even closer to her husband, whispering something he couldn't quite catch. Keanu didn't bristle. He didn't laugh awkwardly or attempt to negotiate. He simply nodded once, his expression steady. "That sounds excellent," he replied softly. Chloe blinked, caught off guard. She had expected hesitation, maybe even a retreat. Most guests, especially those she considered out of place, would have backed down at the price alone. Instead, he had given her no reaction to grasp onto, only composure. "Very well," she said finally, her smile tightening. She scribbled on her pad, though her strokes were more theatrical than necessary. "One royal beef Wellington." She turned sharply and walked away, but her steps lacked their usual confidence. Irritation burned beneath her skin. She had wanted to prove something that the man in worn boots didn't belong at Hell's Gold. Instead, his calm had unsettled her. Back at the service station, she lingered with the order slip in her hand. She glanced toward the kitchen, where the chefs worked in a furious rhythm of clattering pans and shouted commands. Instead of placing the ticket on the line, she tucked it against her clipboard, pretending to check her other tables first. If he wanted to play patient, she thought, then let him wait. Chloe drifted back into the main dining area, her entire posture shifting the moment she left the shadow of table 19. Her smile grew brighter, her steps more graceful, her tone warmer. She approached a pair of moguls seated near the center, their table glowing beneath the chandelier. They were midway through a bottle of Dom Perignon, laughing too loudly at their own jokes, and Chloe leaned in as though they were the most fascinating men in the room. She poured their glasses with theatrical flourish, twisting the bottle just so, catching the light in the gold label before setting it down with reverence. "Perfect pairing with the scallops," she said, her voice smooth and confident. They nodded approvingly, one of them slipping a folded bill discreetly into her apron, as though her performance deserved its own applause. From across the room, Mia, the young server, glanced toward the corner again. Keanu sat quietly, the menu closed now, resting on the table beside his glass. He didn't look impatient. He didn't shift in his chair or check his watch. Instead, he seemed entirely at ease, as though time itself bent around his calm. Mia hesitated, tempted to step in, but Chloe's sharp eyes cut across the floor and froze her in place. At the critics' table, Charles Holloway observed the dynamic with increasing interest. He watched the way Chloe poured wine with flourish for one group, laughed loudly at another, and then deliberately ignored the man in the corner. He had seen arrogance disguised as hospitality before, but rarely so blatant. His gaze lingered on Keanu, the only guest who seemed untouched by the theater. Holloway's instincts told him there was more to this man than worn boots and a faded jacket. Meanwhile, Chloe continued to stall. Instead of heading to the kitchen with the ticket, she circled the room again, stopping at a table of influencers filming themselves with glowing lobster tails. She leaned in, offering suggestions for captions, her laughter sparkling as though she too belonged in their world of curated perfection. Every moment spent at those tables was another moment Keanu's order sat unclaimed. To Chloe, it was a silent game. She convinced herself he would eventually grow restless, embarrassed, maybe even leave without finishing. That would prove her right. But across the dining room, others were beginning to notice the imbalance. And the longer Keanu remained still, the louder the contrast became. The minutes stretched into long, deliberate silence around table 19. The quartet shifted into another piece, their violins weaving notes that rose and fell like a tide, but the music did little to soften the growing awareness in the room. More than one diner had now glanced toward the corner, puzzled by the sight of a man seated alone, still waiting. Keanu remained exactly as he had been, patient, composed, and almost contemplative. His hand rested lightly against the menu, now closed, and his gaze moved occasionally across the room as if he were studying the details that others overlooked. When the pianist's hands trembled slightly in a difficult passage, Keanu's eyes lingered on her, offering a faint nod of recognition. She caught it, steadied herself, and continued with renewed confidence. It was as though his calm extended beyond his table, a quiet ripple that carried through the room. At the bar, Chloe laughed loudly again, her posture exaggerated, her presence designed for attention. To anyone watching closely, her behavior was transparent. She had not submitted Keanu's order, choosing instead to immerse herself in the glow of more profitable tables. She poured, She flattered, she charmed, all while the slip of paper containing his Wellington request remained untouched on her clipboard. Mia passed the utility station with a tray of appetizers and hesitated. "Table 19 still hasn't been served," she whispered nervously to another server. The reply was quick, almost dismissive. "That's Chloe's table. Leave it." But Charles Holloway was no longer leaving it. The critic leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in the corner. He noted the spilled water still staining the wood, the absence of bread or amuse-bouche, the uneven table left unrepaired. More than that, he noted the silence, how the man in worn boots refused to show even a flicker of irritation. To Holloway, that silence said more than any complaint ever could. At a nearby table, the woman in the pearl gown whispered again, this time with more urgency. "It's him. I know it, Island, and she's humiliating him." Her husband's uneasy frown deepened. He glanced toward Chloe, who now leaned in close to another group of guests, laughing as though nothing existed beyond their table. The disparity was glaring now, impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention. And though Chloe still believed she was in control, the balance in the room was already shifting, because patience, when tested this long, becomes a mirror, and everyone was starting to see themselves in it. The dining room glimmered under chandeliers, polished and perfect, but one table remained starkly out of rhythm with the rest. Table 19, wedged by the utility station, buzzed beneath a faulty light. Keanu Reeves sat there in silence, his jacket folded neatly over the back of his chair, his glass of water untouched since Chloe's dismissive pour. He waited. Minutes passed, then more, but his composure never shifted. The faint hum of clattering dishes spilled from the kitchen door behind him, waiters brushed past with trays of steaming entrees, and laughter from the main floor rolled like waves of indulgence. Yet he stayed calm, almost meditative, his presence striking for how little it sought to draw attention. But attention began to find him anyway. The couple in the pearl gown whispered again, the woman unable to look away. "I'm certain now," she said softly. "That's Keanu Reeves. No one else carries themselves like that." Her husband's expression tightened, his earlier doubt thinning as he studied the man more closely. "If you're right," he murmured, "this is going to explode." Across the room, a younger pair of diners, fashionably dressed and live streaming their night, turned their camera briefly toward the back. "That guy looks familiar," one of them said. "Doesn't he? Looks like the guy from John Wick." The other laughed, brushing it off. But the seed had been planted. Murmurs began to ripple in quiet pockets of the restaurant. Mia, the newest server on staff, carried a tray of amuse-bouche past the corner and felt her steps falter. She had seen how long he'd been left unattended, how no bread basket or appetizer had touched his table. Her conscience tugged at her as she approached the service station, where Chloe was arranging stemware with deliberate flair. "Chloe," Mia whispered cautiously, "Table 19 hasn't had anything yet." "He ordered, didn't he?" Chloe's eyes narrowed, irritation sharp, beneath her practiced smile. "He's fine," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "Don't waste your time worrying about him." Mia hesitated, her brow furrowing. "But he's been nothing but polite. Shouldn't we at least?" Chloe cut her off with a snap. "He's no one, Mia. Focus on the brand. This is Hell's Gold, not a soup kitchen. If you want to last here, stop thinking like a waitress and start thinking like the brand we represent." Mia's lips pressed together, shame and unease twisting in her chest. She glanced back toward the corner, where Keanu sat unmoved, his presence a quiet contradiction to everything Chloe had just said. Mia returned to her rounds, but her thoughts wouldn't quiet. Every time she passed the corner, the image of Keanu sitting alone pressed at her conscience. His stillness wasn't resignation. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. He didn't look angry, nor did he look humiliated. He simply existed there, present, watching the room without judgment. It unnerved her. Most guests, after being ignored for so long, would have waved impatiently, asked for a manager, or left altogether. But he sat as though he were waiting for something more than food, as though patience itself was the point. At the service station, Chloe busied herself with the theater of hospitality. She leaned across tables with a smile that gleamed as bright as the chandeliers, filling glasses and fawning over every VIP seated in the main room. To her, appearances mattered more than service. She relished the admiration of those who thought she embodied the standard of hell's gold. But Charles Holloway, seated midway between the glamour of the center tables and the quiet neglect of the corner, saw through the act. He had been dining out long enough to recognize the subtleties of true service. He knew when kindness was authentic and when it was merely performance. Chloe's gestures had the polish of someone playing a part, but not the heart of someone who believed in what they did. His gaze drifted back to Keanu, the man who seemed impervious to the noise and vanity around him. Holloway watched him acknowledge the pianist with a faint nod, watched the corners of his mouth twitch into the smallest smile when a young busser nervously dropped a fork nearby. The man in the corner wasn't impatient, he was present, and that presence was beginning to unnerve the entire room. The woman in the pearl gown whispered again, her voice a thread of urgency. "They're ignoring him on purpose." Her husband shifted uncomfortably, aware that others were starting to glance toward the same shadowed table. The live streamers lowered their phones, curiosity overtaking their scripted commentary. Even the moguls Chloe so eagerly served glanced toward the back, their laughter faltering briefly before resuming. Mia passed Keanu's table once more. This time he looked up, meeting her eyes for just a second. He gave the faintest nod, a gesture so simple yet so grounding it froze her in her tracks. She wanted to bring him bread, to fix the imbalance. But Chloe's earlier words still stung. "He's no one. Focus on the brand." Mia turned away, her steps heavier than before. Charles Holloway leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting on the stem of his wineglass. He didn't drink, not yet. He simply observed, his critic's eye dissecting the contradictions on display. Hell's Gold prided itself on perfection, flawless service, curated elegance, a reputation polished until it gleamed. But the illusion was cracking, and all it took was one quiet man in worn boots. Every glance Holloway cast toward Keanu told him more than any menu could. Here was a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't complained, hadn't demanded recognition. Yet his presence unsettled the staff, disrupted the rhythm, and exposed the hollowness of hospitality that prized appearances over people. It fascinated the critic. He scribbled a few words in his leather-bound notebook, a habit he never abandoned. Stillness louder than performance. Chloe, oblivious to his scrutiny, continued her charade. She laughed too loudly at a producer's half-hearted joke, leaned theatrically to pour a glass of Bordeaux, and glided across the dining room like she was center stage. To her, Keanu's corner was a deliberate void, one she hoped would vanish if ignored long enough. But it didn't vanish. It grew. Whispers threaded through the room, stretching table to table. "That's him, isn't it? Why is he in the back? Has he been served yet?" The murmurs became part of the atmosphere, mingling with the music, the clink of silverware, the hiss of pans from the open kitchen. Guests weren't just dining anymore. They were watching. Mia carried a tray past again and felt her pulse quicken as she caught sight of Keanu's table. She saw the flicker of recognition spreading among the guests, saw the way the pianist's eyes darted toward him more than once. She bit her lip, her conscience battling against Chloe's warning. Finally, unable to resist, she leaned toward Chloe at the service station. "They're starting to notice," Mia whispered. "Everyone's looking. If that really is him." Chloe cut her off with a glare. "Don't," she snapped. "He doesn't matter. He's no one. Keep your head down and do your job." But Charles Holloway had already heard. He wasn't close enough to catch every word, but the venom in Chloe's tone told him enough. He turned his gaze back to Keanu, who remained seated in quiet patience, his hand resting lightly against the rim of his glass. And in that moment, Holloway knew. The story of the evening wouldn't be written by the glittering chandeliers or the expensive entrees. It would be written by the silence at table 19. The clatter of plates and the hum of voices filled the air, but at table 19, time stretched thin. Keanu remained seated quietly, his hands folded loosely on the table, his eyes drifting occasionally toward the pianist or the flickering light above him. He carried himself with the same calm that had marked every moment since his arrival, as though the chaos of the restaurant belonged to another world entirely. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Chloe appeared from the service station carrying a small plate. Her stride was sharp, her heels clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that announced her irritation more than her presence. She didn't glide as she had for the influencers or the moguls. She didn't smile with the warmth she had reserved for the critics' table. She walked like someone approaching a task beneath her, shoulders rigid, jaw tight. Without a word of welcome, she placed the dish in front of him with a muted thud. The plate jolted slightly against the uneven table, and a faint smear appeared on its edge. She didn't attempt to adjust it or clean the mark. "The mushroom tartare," she said coolly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Then, leaning forward just enough that only he could hear, she added, "You have had tartare before, right?" It wasn't a question meant to clarify. It was meant to belittle. The tone carried an assumption that a man dressed in worn boots and a faded jacket would never have experienced such cuisine, that he was sitting in a seat far above his station. A few nearby diners noticed the exchange, though they couldn't hear her exact words. They saw the dismissive tilt of her head, the smirk at the corner of her lips, and they saw Keanu's response. He didn't frown, he didn't recoil. Instead, he looked down at the plate with quiet appreciation. He lifted his gaze to Chloe and nodded once. "It looks wonderful," he said softly. "Thank you." The words were simple, almost ordinary, but the weight behind them unsettled her. She had expected defensiveness, irritation, or even embarrassment. Instead, she was met with gratitude, genuine, unshaken gratitude. Chloe's smirk faltered for just a moment. She straightened, her jaw tightening as though she had been the one unsettled. Without replying, she spun on her heel and walked briskly back toward the service station, muttering something under her breath that only the nearest busser could hear. At table 19, Keanu picked up his fork, unhurried, and tasted the dish. His expression didn't change, but the faint nod he gave to himself was enough. The tartare was cool, earthy, and delicately seasoned, its flavors layered with the precision Hell's Gold was known for. Keanu set his fork down after the first bite and let the taste settle, not rushing, not distracted. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as though silently acknowledging the effort of the unseen chef behind the plate. Around him, however, the weight of the moment grew heavier. A few diners who had been whispering before now openly turned in their seats, glancing toward the back corner where the quiet man sat. They had caught Chloe's sarcastic remark, the sharpness of her tone, and had seen the serenity of his reply. "That was Reeves," one voice whispered across the main floor. "Did you hear how he thanked her? Like she hadn't just mocked him." The woman in the pearl gown leaned forward, her eyes shimmering with both recognition and outrage. "It's him. I told you. And she's treating him like he doesn't belong." Her husband finally stopped pretending not to notice, his jaw set, as his gaze followed Chloe's return to the station. Charles Holloway scribbled again in his notebook, his pen scratching the page quickly. He had seen arrogance in dining rooms before, but rarely had he seen it clash so violently against such dignity. He studied Keanu carefully, the calm lines of his face, the unhurried motion of his hand, as he lifted his glass of water. This wasn't a man crushed by insult. This was someone who carried himself like he had nothing to prove. Mia passed near the corner carrying a tray of plates toward another table and slowed her step as she caught sight of Keanu tasting the tartare. She saw him smile faintly, not toward her or anyone else, but to the plate itself, as if acknowledging the artistry of the dish. That subtle gesture tightened her throat. How could someone be treated so poorly, yet show nothing but appreciation? She wanted to speak, to say something, but Chloe's warning still echoed in her mind. He's no one. Focus on the brand. Mia turned her eyes back to her tray and hurried on, her chest heavy with conflict. Meanwhile, the murmurs spread wider. The live-streaming influencers abandoned their phones mid-recording, leaning toward each other with incredulous expressions. "Why is he back there?" one whispered. "Why hasn't he been moved to the center?" The questions had no answer, and the silence from the corner became the loudest sound in the room. Chloe lingered at the wine station, stealing glances toward table 19. She expected him to push the plate aside, to call her back with irritation. to signal the manager with frustration. That would have confirmed everything she believed, that he didn't belong, that he was fragile beneath the weight of refinement. But instead, Keanu sat perfectly still, eating slowly, savoring each bite with quiet care. It unnerved her. The more serene he became, the more rattled she felt. His calmness stripped away her armor. She realized with an edge of fear that she couldn't control him, couldn't provoke him, couldn't reduce him to the caricature she wanted others to see. Charles Holloway noticed the tension too. He saw how Chloe's shoulders stiffened each time she glanced toward the back, how her laughter grew louder and hollower with every table she served at the front. She was unraveling, not because of anything Keanu did, but because of what he refused to do. He refused to break. And slowly, the rest of the dining room began to orbit him. Guests leaned subtly to watch, their conversations faltering. Even the pianist's melody softened, as though she too was following the rhythm of his stillness. Keanu Reeves, sitting at a broken table by the exit, had become the quiet center of Hell's Gold. The woman in the pearl gown turned to her husband again, her voice trembling with conviction. "He's changing this room without saying a word." Her husband nodded slowly, unable to look away. Mia stood near the service corridor, her heart pounding. She wanted to bring him bread, to wipe the water stains from the table, to do something, anything that restored the dignity he deserved. But Chloe's cutting words haunted her, holding her frozen in place. At table 19, Keanu set his fork down and folded his hands loosely in front of him. His eyes lifted once more, sweeping the room, not with accusation, but with quiet presence. He met no one's gaze directly, yet somehow everyone felt seen. The appetizer plate was nearly empty, but the lesson it carried filled the dining room. It was no longer about mushroom tartare. It was about patience, dignity, and the sharp contrast between arrogance and humility. Chloe realized it too late. The man she had tried to bury in the shadows was now illuminating the entire restaurant, and nothing she did could dim that light. The air inside Hell's Gold shifted. What had once been effortless luxury began to ripple with unease. Diners leaned closer to each other, their voices hushed but urgent. The whispers circled the chandeliers like restless birds, dipping from table to table, growing sharper with each retelling. "That's him," someone murmured near the bar. "Keanu Reeves. I'd know that face anywhere." A young food blogger at a central table leaned toward her partner, her phone hovering above her plate. "Why is he in the corner? That's practically the utility station. It doesn't make sense." Her partner frowned, adjusting his glasses. "And why is he still waiting? Look at him. No bread, no wine, no entree. This place prides itself on service, yet the most famous man in the room is being treated like a nobody." The woman in the pearl gown exchanged a pointed glance with her husband. She no longer whispered with speculation now, she whispered with certainty. "They're humiliating him, on purpose." Mia's nerves were frayed as she returned from the kitchen with another tray. Each time she walked past table 19, the knot in her chest grew tighter. Keanu remained composed, but she couldn't ignore the growing buzz of guests who had recognized him. It was becoming impossible to pretend nothing was wrong. She approached the service station cautiously. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the dining room. "They're starting to notice. People know who he island. We can't keep ignoring him." Chloe's eyes flashed with annoyance. She straightened her posture, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her sleeve. "Let them notice. It doesn't change a thing. He walked in here looking like that. He doesn't fit the image of Hell's Gold. And as far as I'm concerned, the brand comes before any one diner." Mia's stomach twisted. "But he's been nothing but kind. He hasn't complained once. He deserves better than this." Chloe leaned closer, her words sharp enough to cut. "He deserves what he earns. And right now, all he's earned is the back corner. Do your job, Mia. Stop worrying about him." But not everyone shared Chloe's view. Charles Holloway, silent and watchful, rested his chin lightly against his knuckles. His eyes moved between Chloe's forced smile, Mia's troubled expression, and Keanu's unshakable calm. He didn't write a single note yet, but his mind was already drafting sentences that could echo far beyond these gilded walls. The string quartet in the corner played on, but even their graceful notes couldn't smother the tension pulsing through the dining room. Guests who had once been focused on their lobster tails and wine pairings now stole glances toward the dim back corner, their curiosity fed by every passing whisper. A group of young bloggers, seated near the golden bar, leaned toward each other with their phones tucked away. One of them whispered, "This is crazy. If that really is Keanu Reeves, why on earth is he sitting next to a tray stand? And why hasn't anyone taken care of him?" Another nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward Chloe. She's pretending not to see him, but the whole room sees it now. The longer this goes on, the worse it looks. At table 19, Keanu lifted his glass of water again. He drank slowly, his movements deliberate, unaffected by the storm of murmurs building around him. The serenity in his posture only deepened the contrast between his treatment and the restaurant's golden image. That contrast was beginning to poison the very air. Mia felt the pressure mounting inside her chest. She returned from delivering entrees and lingered at the service station, watching Chloe laugh too loudly with a group of venture capitalists at the center tables. Her colleague's performance was flawless to the untrained eye, but Mia saw the cracks, the tightness around Chloe's jaw, the way her shoulders tensed whenever whispers swelled. Louder, it was all there. Finally, Mia tried again. "Chloe, this isn't right," she said quietly, urgency lacing her words. "We can't just keep pretending. He's waiting, and people are noticing." If Gordon finds out, Chloe cut her off with a glare so sharp it froze Mia mid-sentence. "Enough. Do you want to ruin your career before it even begins? Stop making this about him. It's about us, our image, our brand." Mia swallowed her protest, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up another tray, but her eyes betrayed her defiance. She looked once more toward Keanu, who sat like a pillar of calm against the storm, and the guilt inside her grew heavier. Charles Holloway had seen enough. He didn't need to catch every word between the servers. The tension spoke for itself. His pen touched paper for the first time that night. "Dignity absent where it matters most," he wrote. The dining room had shifted, and the cracks were spreading wider. The crescendo of whispers had reached the farthest corners of the dining room. Diners who had once been consumed by their own plates now tilted their heads, straining to catch details about the man in the shadows. What began as hushed speculation had grown into a current of unease flowing beneath the chandeliers. A young man at a corner table, scrolling on his phone, froze. His eyes widened as he compared the face at table 19 with a photo on his screen. "It's him," he whispered, breathless. "It's really Keanu Reeves." His voice carried just enough to be overheard by another table, and the ripples spread faster. Bloggers scribbled notes on napkins. Influencers shifted uncomfortably, their staged laughs faltering. The illusion of Hell's Gold untouchable, flawless, was unraveling in real time. The room wasn't focused on the gilded entrees or the rare wines anymore. It was focused on a man who hadn't asked for attention but had become impossible to ignore. Mia returned from the kitchen, her pulse pounding in her ears. She saw Keanu's patience, his quiet dignity, and it burned against the injustice unfolding around him. Every fiber of her wanted to intervene, to serve him properly, to give him what he deserved. But Chloe's shadow loomed large, her voice still echoing, "He's no one. Focus on the brand." At the service station, Chloe tossed her hair back with a brittle laugh. She leaned toward another server and whispered, "I don't care if people think it's him. If he wanted respect, he should have looked the part." But Charles Holloway heard enough. The words weren't meant for him, yet they sliced through the noise and lodged firmly in his mind. He placed his notebook flat on the table, staring at the empty page for a moment before writing with deliberate strokes. "When arrogance eclipses service, the soul of hospitality is lost." He closed the notebook gently, but his decision was sealed. Whatever happened next, this evening would not be remembered for its truffles or chandeliers. It would be remembered for how one restaurant, blinded by its obsession with image, exposed itself in the presence of the very man who embodied humility. And as Keanu lifted his glass again, still calm, still composed, the truth became undeniable. The whole room was watching now. The kitchen of Hell's Gold pulsed like a living organism, flames leaping, copper pans colliding, voices shouting over the roar of steam. It was a symphony of precision where every note mattered. Orders appeared on the screens above the pass in steady rhythm, each ticket clipped and relayed with military efficiency. Nothing in Gordon Ramsay's flagship kitchen ever fell through the cracks. But tonight, something did. At first, Gordon barely noticed. He was in his element, sleeves rolled, plating with the sharp movements of a conductor guiding an orchestra. 2 scallops, 1 risotto. Move it, he barked, and the line responded in unison. Dishes slid forward, gleaming under the lights. Yet, as he glanced up at the screen, his brow furrowed. A ticket had lingered at the bottom for far too long. 40 minutes, he muttered under his breath. He stepped closer, scanning the order again. The signature, Wellington, the crown jewel of the menu. The dish no one waited for more than 25 minutes, not even on the busiest nights. "Who the hell is holding this Wellington ticket?" he snapped, his voice slicing through the roar of the kitchen. The bustle stuttered. Knives paused mid-chop. Pans hovered above flames. The energy shifted in an instant. One sous chef, barely out of culinary school, stammered, "Chef, the ticket never came through. It was written, but it wasn't punched in." Ramsay's eyes narrowed like blades. "What do you mean it wasn't punched in?" 40 minutes sitting there, and no one thought to ask why. His voice rose, sharp enough to make even the seasoned line cooks flinch. The junior sous chef swallowed hard. "It's for table 19. The entire kitchen froze. A hush fell so fast it felt unnatural in the roaring space. Table 19 was known tonight as the Forgotten Corner, the one every server whispered about. Ramsay's gut tightened. He knew something was wrong before he even asked. "Who's at table 19? He demanded. No one answered. The silence itself was an indictment. Ramsay slammed his palm against the stainless steel counter, the sound cracking like a gunshot. 40 minutes. A guest has been waiting 40 minutes in my restaurant for my Wellington, and you let this slide?" His voice was thunder now, rolling through every corner of the kitchen. The truth was undeniable. The failure wasn't in the cooking, it was in the service, and Gordon Ramsay would not allow it to stand. The junior sous chef glanced nervously at the expeditor, but no one dared speak. Ramsay's stare was relentless, his fury magnified by the betrayal of standards he had spent his life building. "Table 19, he repeated, his voice lower now, more dangerous. "Who seated that table? Who took that order?" A line cook muttered under his breath. "It was Chloe, chef." The name hit the air like a blade. Ramsay's jaw clenched. He turned to the expediter. "Get me the order slip." Within seconds, the small sheet of paper was in his hand, smudged with ink but clearly marked, "Beef Wellington, table 19, time stamped 41 minutes ago." He crumpled it in his fist. 41 bloody minutes. A guest has been sitting out there invisible, forgotten, while the rest of this circus is tripping over itself to impress influencers. His words cut deeper than his volume. The silence was suffocating. One of the older sous chefs finally spoke, his voice low and careful. "Chef, the guest at table 19, it's Keanu Reeves." The room shifted. Pans stopped sizzling, eyes widened. Even the most hardened cooks felt their stomachs lurch. Ramsay's face darkened, his anger no longer just professional, but personal. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that Keanu Reeves has been sitting in my restaurant for 40 minutes without so much as a plate of bread and his Wellington order ignored?" No one answered. They didn't need to. The truth was painted in the cum. Silence. Ramsay's voice erupted again, shaking the walls. "Do you have any idea what that man has done for this place? Do you know how much respect he's earned around the world, not for fame, but for being the kind of human being this industry should aspire to serve?" The staff shrank under the weight of his words. No one dared move. The only sound was the sharp hiss of a forgotten pan burning in the corner. Ramsay ripped off his apron and threw it onto the counter. His chest heaved with fury. "That's it, I'll deal with this myself." The double doors to the dining room swung open with a violent push, and the noise of the kitchen spilled into the elegant hush beyond. Diners looked up, forks frozen mid-air, as Gordon Ramsay stormed into the heart of Hell's Gold. The dining room froze as if someone had struck a gong. The quartet faltered mid-note. Glasses clinked faintly as hands trembled. All eyes followed the storm cutting through the golden light. Gordon Ramsay moved with purpose, his white coat crisp, his gaze fixed like a hawk descending on prey. Servers parted instinctively, shrinking against the walls. The influencers at the bar lowered their phones, their staged smiles fading into nervous silence. Even Chloe, caught mid-laugh at a VIP table, stiffened as her wineglass nearly slipped from her hand. Her throat tightened. She knew instantly who Ramsay was coming for. Ramsay's voice carried before he even reached the back corner. Table 19. The words cut across the hush, low and edged with fury. He didn't need to shout. His presence alone filled the space with thunder. Keanu Reeves looked up calmly, his expression unchanged, hands folded loosely before him. He didn't flinch at the sight of Ramsay, didn't lean back, didn't rise. He simply met the chef's gaze with steady eyes that carried both patience and weight. The contrast was electric. Ramsay's storm against Keanu's stillness. The entire dining room held its breath, suspended between two worlds colliding. Chloe's heart hammered in her chest. Her eyes darted from Ramsay's clenched fists to Keanu's serene posture. The truth struck her like lightning. 40 minutes of disdain, 40 minutes of arrogance, and it had all led to this. Ramsay reached the table, his footsteps echoing on the marble. He stopped just short of Keanu and spoke, his voice sharp but controlled, every syllable laced with meaning. "Mr. Reeves, I wasn't informed you'd be dining with us tonight." Gasps rippled across the room. "Mr. Reeves," the words shattered the whispers into certainty. Diners turned to one another, stunned, ashamed, realizing what they had witnessed was not just poor service, it was humiliation. Chloe's face drained of color. The glass in her hand clattered against the table as she whispered to no one in particular, "Oh God, what have I done?" Ramsay didn't look at her. His eyes stayed locked on Keanu, a mix of anger and respect burning in them. For the first time that night, Hell's Gold was silent. Not for wealth, not for prestige, but for the man who had waited patiently in the shadows, now revealed in the light. The dining room of Hell's Gold felt as though it had been struck by a sudden storm. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation, as Gordon Ramsay stormed in from the kitchen. His presence was magnetic and terrifying all at once. The sound of his shoes on the marble floor echoed, sharp and deliberate, each step commanding the attention of every guest. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Forks hovered in the air. Even the pianist in the corner faltered, his fingers freezing above the keys before stumbling into silence. The only sound that remained was the faint hiss of candles flickering in golden holders, as though the restaurant itself had forgotten how to breathe. Every set of eyes followed Ramsay's path. Diners craned their necks, whispering in tones so low they might as well have been prayers. "What's happening?" someone whispered near the bar. "Why is he so furious?" The answer revealed itself. With each purposeful stride, Gordon took not toward the main lounge, not toward the critics or influencers, but toward the dim corner of the restaurant, where one man sat quietly, unbothered by the chaos that now surrounded him. Keanu Reeves. Stillness met fury. Keanu didn't rise. He didn't shift. He simply lifted his head as Ramsay approached, his calm presence an almost surreal contrast to the storm bearing down on him. His eyes, steady and unflinching, met Ramsay's with a quiet strength that seemed to slow time itself. Ramsay stopped in front of the table. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of a hammer. "Mr. Reeves, I wasn't told you'd be dining with us tonight." The words hit the dining room like thunder. A collective gasp swept the crowd, spreading from table to table until the entire room was alive with disbelief. Murmurs spilled into the air, louder now, no longer whispers. "Mr. Reeves? Did he say Keanu Reeves? Oh my God, it's really him." At the service station, Chloe froze, the color drained from her face, as though someone had pulled the life out of her in one swift motion. Her hands, which had moments earlier been animated with forced charm, now trembled uncontrollably. The truth had been spoken aloud, and there was no retreat from it. Her chest tightened as Ramsay's words replayed in her mind. Mr. Reeves. The very man she had dismissed, belittled and shoved into the shadows, had been someone her restaurant should have honored. The dining room was no longer just a place for dinner. It had transformed into a stage, and every guest was a witness. The chandeliers glimmered above like spotlights, their reflections caught in rows of wine glasses that now sat untouched. The tension was palpable, pressing down on the room until even the wealthiest patrons felt small beneath its weight. Keanu finally moved, not hurriedly, not nervously, but with the deliberate calm of a man who carried nothing to prove. He placed his napkin gently on the table, lifted his gaze toward Gordon, and said softly, "I didn't want a scene. I only wanted a quiet dinner." The simplicity of the statement carried more power than any raised voice could. His tone was even serene, yet the words landed with a force that made the crowd shift in their seats. Here was a man who had been humiliated, dismissed, and still chose dignity over anger. Ramsay's jaw tightened. He nodded once, the muscle in his cheek twitching. "And you didn't get one," he admitted, his voice lower now, but still carrying through the room. His eyes burned with frustration, not at Keanu, but at the betrayal of the very standards he demanded from his staff. Gasps and murmurs continued to ripple across the restaurant. A woman in a pearl gown leaned toward her husband, whispering, "We saw it. We saw how they treated him." Another man, a blogger seated near the front, fumbled for his phone, already knowing this moment would explode beyond these golden walls. At the edge of the dining room, Chloe's hands gripped the dine service station, as though it were the only thing holding her upright. Sweat prickled at the back of her neck. She wanted to vanish into the marble floor, to erase the last hour, to undo every sharp word and every disdainful glance she had thrown toward the man now revealed as not just any guest, but a name known around the world. Her voice caught in her throat. She whispered to herself, I didn't know." But the words weren't enough. Nothing could undo what the entire room had witnessed. Every pair of eyes began to turn toward her. Chloe's chest tightened as the weight of the crowd's eyes pinned her in place. Every detail of her behavior, every smirk, every sarcastic tone, every deliberate slight was no longer private. It had been laid bare before the very people she had sought to impress. Ramsay didn't look at her yet. His focus stayed locked on Keanu, but his voice carried across the room with a gravity that made everyone feel included in the rebuke. "In this house," he said firmly, "every guest matters, no exceptions." The words struck harder than a shout. Diners shifted uncomfortably, realizing the lesson wasn't meant just for his staff. It was for them too, for every glance they had stolen, every moment they had stayed silent while a man was diminished. Keanu, still composed, offered a faint nod. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, "but I'm not here to take anything away. I only came for the food." That line pierced the atmosphere like a blade. A truth so simple it cut through the vanity of the evening. He hadn't demanded recognition. He hadn't sought applause. He had asked only to be treated like anyone else, and he hadn't been. At last, Ramsay turned his head toward the service station. His eyes found Chloe. She froze under the intensity of his glare. The crimson of her lipstick, once a symbol of control and confidence, now looked stark against the pallor of her face. The silence that followed was merciless. Not a fork clattered, not a cough echoed. Even the string quartet, sensing the gravity of the moment, remained motionless, bows poised above strings they dared not play. Chloe's lips parted, desperate to explain, to excuse, to beg, but the words caught in her throat. She had no defense. Everyone had seen. Everyone had heard. And now Gordon Ramsay stood ready to deliver the reckoning she had tried so hard to avoid. Her world of appearances and carefully curated power shattered in an instant. What remained was the undeniable truth that humility mattered more than status, and dignity outweighed any illusion of prestige. The silence inside Hell's Gold was thick enough to break. Gordon Ramsay stood tall in the center of the dining room, his face carved with fury. But beneath the surface, there was something deeper, a disappointment that cut sharper than anger. He drew a breath, his chest heaving as he turned his eyes away from Chloe and back to the guests who waited, hanging on his next words. "You all need to understand something," Gordon said, his voice firm and resonant, reaching every corner of the restaurant. The man sitting at this table isn't just another guest. He's one of the reasons this place is still standing. Gasps stirred the air, scattered at first, then rippling in waves as diners looked back and forth between Keanu and Gordon. Some leaned forward, mouths open. Others shook their heads in disbelief, certain they must have misheard. Ramsay continued, his tone unflinching. When the pandemic shut down restaurants across the globe, this house, my house, nearly fell. We were close to closing the doors for good. Staff were days away from losing their jobs. Families would have gone without paychecks. And then a phone call came. He pointed directly at Keanu. From him, the crowd erupted into hushed murmurs. A young woman in a glittering dress gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "No way," someone whispered at the bar. Keanu shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes low, almost uncomfortable with the attention. He hadn't come to be the center of this. But Ramsay pressed forward, unwilling to let the truth stay buried. He didn't ask for credit. He didn't want his name on the paperwork. He didn't demand recognition in the press. He simply said, "Let's save it. Let's keep people employed. Let's build it back the right way." The words fell like heavy stones, sinking deep into the minds of everyone present. For the first time all evening, the glow of chandeliers and the shimmer of crystal glasses seemed small, dwarfed by the weight of humility laid bare before them. Keanu's stillness spoke louder than any speech. He wasn't basking in the revelation. He looked almost uneasy, as though the truth being revealed was more exposure than he had ever wanted. And that made the room fall even quieter, because true humility leaves no space for ego. A heavy silence clung to the air, broken only by the clinking of a wine glass as someone set it down too quickly. The faces in the room reflected the same stunned disbelief, a recognition that the man they had dismissed, judged, or whispered about in the shadows had been carrying them all along. Gordon's voice grew sharper, though not louder. It didn't need to be. His words carried weight on their own. While others walked away, while investors pulled their money, while critics said fine dining was finished, this man stepped in quietly. He gave what he could, not because he wanted ownership, not because he wanted fame, but because he wanted every single person on my staff to keep their job. Whispers turned to soft gasps. At a table near the front, a businessman whispered to his wife, "He saved them. He saved all of this." She nodded, eyes wide, her hand clutching his arm. Gordon stepped closer to Keanu's table, his voice low but strong. "You all dined here through those dark months. You tasted the food. You saw the lights stay on, but you never knew why. It wasn't because of me alone. It was because of him." He jabbed a finger toward Keanu, though not in anger, more as a gesture of recognition. The crowd's collective gaze followed, every eye landing on Keanu Reeves, still seated in his quiet corner. His worn boots, his faded jacket, his calm posture, all suddenly carried a weight no luxury suit could replicate. Keanu finally lifted his eyes, looking not at Gordon, not at the crowd, but down the long stretch of tables shimmering beneath the chandeliers. His voice was soft, almost reluctant. It wasn't about saving a restaurant. It was about saving people. "I didn't want anyone here to feel invisible." The words hit like a drumbeat of truth. Diners shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable with the realization that only minutes ago, they themselves had let him be treated as though he were invisible. Even Charles Holloway, the critic seated near the center, set his pen down. His eyes narrowed, not with judgment, but with something closer to respect. For once, there was no review to write. The story was writing itself. Chloe's knees nearly buckled as Gordon's words sank in. She had dismissed him as if he were no one, shoved him into the shadows, and all the while, he had been one of the very people who had made sure she even had a job to come to. Her throat was dry, her lips trembling, but no words came. Gasps rippled again as Ramsay's explanation reached its peak. "This isn't just some celebrity cameo," he said, his tone cutting the air clean. "This man is a partner in spirit and action. He kept the lights on, he kept you all employed, and he never asked for a headline. He wanted fairness, dignity, and nothing else. The truth struck the crowd with undeniable force. A woman seated near the back whispered to her friend, "He saved this place, and they treated him like trash." The friend nodded, shame etched into her features. Keanu lifted his hand slightly, not to demand attention, but to temper it. His voice was quiet, steady, carrying the weight of sincerity. "I didn't want this revealed. Gordon, you know that. I only wanted the staff to have a chance, to keep going. The rest doesn't matter." Ramsay's jaw tightened. He nodded but replied firmly, "It matters now. They need to know who you are and what you've done." The chandeliers glimmered above, but the room no longer felt gilded by wealth. It was heavy with humility. Guests who had come for a night of excess found themselves reflecting instead on dignity, service, and the quiet strength of a man who had walked through their door without asking for anything but fairness. Charles Holloway leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on his notebook but his pen untouched. His voice, deep and deliberate, carried just enough to be heard by those around him. "You don't see grace like that often, and when you do, you never forget it." The room seemed to breathe again, though slower now, as if the weight of what had been revealed demanded reverence. Every diner, every server, even Chloe herself, felt the ground shift beneath their feet. This was no longer dinner. This was a moment that would stay with them forever. Chloe's voice cracked as she finally forced words past her lips. I didn't know who he was," she stammered, her hands trembling against the service station. Her voice carried through the dining room, but it was weak, thin, swallowed by the heavy silence that followed. Gordon Ramsay's gaze locked on her, sharp as a blade. He took a single step forward, his presence towering, his voice low but deadly precise. "That's the problem," he said, each syllable deliberate. "You thought he was no one." A collective murmur ran through the restaurant, like a wave breaking against marble. The truth was so simple, so undeniable, it pierced deeper than any scream ever could. Diners shifted uneasily in their seats, the weight of Gordon's words pressing not only on Chloe, but on everyone who had sat quietly and allowed it all to unfold. Chloe's eyes welled with tears. She tried again, her words stumbling. I didn't mean." Ramsay cut her off with a raised hand, his tone harsh but controlled. "Intent doesn't matter. Respect does. Dignity does. Every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated like a guest, not judged by their boots, their jacket, or how much you think they matter." His voice grew sharper, filling the space without ever rising to a scream. "This isn't service. What you gave tonight was arrogance, ego dressed up as professionalism, and it poisoned everything this place stands for." The words struck deeper than the sting of humiliation. Chloe's shoulders collapsed inward, her confidence shattered. She opened her mouth to protest, but the room itself seemed to rise against her silence. The faces of diners, wealthy, glamorous, powerful, now turned toward her, and none of them offered the faintest defense. Keanu sat quietly at his table, his presence unchanged. His eyes were calm, steady, but they carried a depth that made Chloe shrink even further. It wasn't anger in his gaze, it was disappointment, and somehow that cut her even deeper than Ramsay's words. Charles Holloway, the critic, folded his hands over his notebook and murmured softly to those near him, "That's the truest lesson you'll ever see in a dining room." And the rest of the diners, shifting uncomfortably in their luxury seats, realized the same thing. This wasn't just Chloe's mistake, it was their silence too. Chloe's breathing grew shallow as the silence pressed down on her. She clutched her order pad as though it could anchor her, but the weight of Gordon's gaze kept her frozen in place. Her voice trembled when she tried again. I thought he didn't belong here." The admission only deepened the sting of the moment. Gordon leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous for its control. "And who gave you the right to decide who belongs?" His eyes swept the room, not just at her, but at every diner present. "What gives any of us the right to judge another human being by their clothes, their shoes, or the money we assume they have in their pocket?" No one dared to answer. The chandeliers above glittered coldly, casting reflections across the crystal glasses that moments ago had seemed so extravagant. Now, they felt hollow, meaningless in the face of such a raw truth. Gordon jabbed a finger toward the floor. This restaurant isn't built on ego. It isn't built on appearances. It's built on service, on dignity, on treating every single person with respect, whether they're a billionaire, a bus driver, or a man who just wants a quiet meal. His words struck hard, each one echoing in the stillness of the room. Diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and a few lowered their eyes to their plates. They knew he wasn't speaking only to Chloe. He was speaking to them. Chloe's tears spilled now, rolling down her cheeks as her hands shook. I didn't know," she whispered again, almost inaudibly. Gordon's reply was immediate. "That's not good enough. It's never good enough. Because tonight, you didn't just disrespect him." He turned, gesturing toward Keanu. "You disrespected every value this place stands for. You disrespected every person who ever walked in here believing they mattered." Keanu lifted his gaze slightly, his expression unchanged, his silence louder than anything else in the room. His stillness was a mirror, forcing Chloe and everyone watching to confront what they had done, or failed to do. A couple at the front table exchanged guilty glances. The woman whispered, "We should have said something." Her partner nodded, eyes lowered in shame. The lesson wasn't Chloe's alone anymore. It belonged to everyone in that golden room. The air inside Hell's Gold felt charged, almost suffocating. Every word Gordon spoke settled like lead in the hearts of the diners, who had once laughed, whispered, and ignored the man seated at the worst table in the house. He straightened his posture, his eyes never leaving Chloe. "You see, arrogance is easy. Dismissing people is easy. But service, true service, isn't about making kings feel like kings. It's about making every guest feel like a human being who matters." His voice softened slightly, though the force of his words did not. "And tonight, you forgot that." Chloe's tears streaked her makeup, the sharp crimson lipstick and perfect bun now looking like a mask slipping from her face. She couldn't look at Keanu. She couldn't look at anyone. She whispered again, voice cracking, "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, but no one applauded them. No one rushed to comfort her. The silence made it clear. Apologies without change meant nothing. Gordon turned back to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the room like a searchlight. "And what about the rest of you? You saw it, you heard it, and you sat in silence. You let it happen. How many of you thought, it's not my place to play? Interfere? How many of you thought he was no one worth defending?" The questions cut deep. Several diners shifted in their seats, ashamed. The couple in pearls lowered their heads. A young influencer at the front bit her lip, regret flashing across her face. The weight of their complicity pressed down harder than the chandeliers above them. Keanu finally spoke, his voice soft, steady, and merciful. "It isn't just about one server," he said. "It's about how we all see each other. How quick we are to dismiss someone because they don't fit the image we expect. Tonight, I wasn't invisible because of her alone. I was invisible because no one chose to see me." The words echoed in the stillness, and this time, no one could escape them. Diners bowed their heads. Even Charles Holloway, the critic, closed his notebook and let out a heavy breath. In that moment, humility had triumphed over ego, and everyone in the room felt it. Keanu pushed his chair back slowly, the faint scrape against the marble floor echoing louder than any voice in the hushed dining room. He rose to his full height, calm and unshaken, his presence commanding without effort. The chandeliers above shimmered against the lines of his worn jacket, but it was his stillness that drew every eye in the room. He didn't raise his hands for attention. He didn't need to. The silence was already his. He let it linger, gave the moment space to breathe, and then he spoke. His voice was gentle, steady, carrying across the room without strain. "Tonight wasn't about food," he said. "It became a mirror that showed us who we are when faced with someone we think doesn't belong." The words settled like stones in the chest of every listener. Diners exchanged uneasy glances. The staff shifted on their feet. Some lowered their heads, as though unwilling to meet the reflection Keanu held up before them. He continued, his tone still soft but piercing. It's easy to treat someone well when you think they're powerful, or wealthy, or famous. But true dignity isn't about status. It's about humanity. It's about how we treat the person we don't recognize, the person who doesn't fit our picture of importance. Chloe's shoulders quivered as she absorbed the truth, her eyes glistening. But Keanu's gaze moved beyond her, sweeping the room. I didn't sit in that corner to make a point. I sat there because it's where I was led. And what unfolded wasn't just one person's mistake. It was a choice that many of you made, silently, when you looked away. A ripple of discomfort moved through the golden room. A businessman adjusted his cufflinks nervously. A woman in pearls lowered her eyes to the untouched glass of wine in front of her. The couple of bloggers whispered no longer. Their phones lay flat on the table. Keanu's voice grew quieter, yet somehow stronger. This night showed us something. It showed us that status blinds us, ego misleads us, and silence can make us complicit. But it also showed us the chance to choose differently. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, and the entire dining room seemed to hold its breath. Keanu let his words rest in the silence for a moment, before continuing, his gaze steady, unflinching. "I've been in many rooms like this," he said softly. "Rooms filled with power, influence, and wealth. And yet, some of the loneliest people I've ever met sat at tables just like these. Because true worth doesn't come from what's on your plate or the clothes on your back. It comes from the way you treat others when no one is watching." The diners listened, spellbound. The chandeliers above sparkled, but the room felt stripped bare, every glittering surface unable to distract from the raw truth in his voice. A man at a corner table shifted, ashamed, as if his fine tuxedo suddenly felt like a costume. Keanu's voice carried a quiet conviction. Dignity is not reserved for the wealthy. Respect is not earned by a price tag. Every single one of us, regardless of who we are or what we wear, deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be treated with decency. That is the standard, not wealth, not fame, not status. Chloe's tears continued to fall, her once perfect posture now broken. She wasn't the only one. A woman at a central table wiped at her eyes with the edge of a silk napkin. Even Charles Holloway, the critic who had seen countless performances in rooms like this, looked deeply moved, his pen lying forgotten by his plate. Keanu's gaze swept across the room again, softer now, but firm. "Tonight, you all saw a man treated like he didn't belong, and most of you stayed silent. You thought it wasn't your business. But every time we stay silent, we allow dignity to be stolen. And when dignity is stolen from one person, we all lose something." The weight of the message pressed down, like a tide. Guests lowered their heads, unable to escape the mirror Keanu held up. Some clenched their hands together on the table. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Keanu let out a quiet breath. "But we also have a choice," he said. "A choice to do better. A choice to see the person in front of us, no matter what they look like. A choice to remember that kindness is the highest standard we can live by." The words struck deeper than any reprimand Gordon had given that night. They weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried truth, and truth was enough. The room remained silent as Keanu's words sank into every corner of the golden dining hall. He stood tall, not demanding attention, but commanding it through sheer presence. His voice lowered, almost intimate, yet it carried to the farthest table. "We build walls with our judgments. We convince ourselves that some people are worthy of respect, while others are not. But those walls don't just keep people out, they trap us inside them too." He let the thought breathe before continuing. "Tonight wasn't about me. It was about all of us. It was about how quick we are to measure others, and how slow we are to measure ourselves. This restaurant this night became a mirror. And when you looked into it, what did you see? Did you see compassion? Or did you see indifference?" Heads bowed lower. The couple who had once whispered doubts about Keanu now exchanged ashamed glances, their earlier words echoing back at them like accusations. The influencers at the front table slid their phones aside completely, ashamed at how much energy they had spent curating appearances while ignoring the reality in front of them. Keanu's eyes softened, though his tone remained steady. "It's not too late to choose differently. Every day gives us the chance to tear down those walls, to treat people with dignity, not because of who they are, but simply because they are human." Charles Holloway, the Broad critic, exhaled slowly and nodded, his voice breaking the silence just enough for those near him to hear. "This will be remembered," he murmured. But his notebook remained closed because some truths didn't need ink, they needed action. Keanu turned slightly, his gaze moving toward Chloe, then back to the diners. "This isn't about shame. It's about responsibility. If you felt something tonight, hold on to it. Let it change the way you see people. Let it change the way you act the next time someone walks through your door and doesn't fit the picture you had in mind." His final words carried through the hall like a quiet prayer. Dignity doesn't cost a thing, but withholding it costs us everything. The chandeliers glittered above, the plates remained untouched, and the silence stretched on, not empty, but full, heavy with reflection. In that moment, the night no longer belonged to Hell's Gold. It belonged to the lesson everyone had just learned. For a long moment, no one dared to move. Keanu's words still hung in the air like a weight no one wanted to break. Then, slowly, Charles Holloway, the man whose reputation could make or destroy any restaurant in the city, rose from his chair. His movement drew every eye, the faint scrape of his chair sounding louder than the music that had quietly resumed. He lifted his glass of wine, not with showmanship, but with solemn respect. "I have spent decades eating in rooms like this," Charles said, his voice carrying with the authority of a man who had judged thousands of dishes, but rarely praised the people behind them. "And I can tell you this much tonight. No flavor, no aroma, no pairing could rival the lesson we were just served. We came here for indulgence. What we received was truth. And truth is rarer than truffles." The toast struck deeper than applause ever could. Yet, applause came, tentative at first. A few guests brought their hands together gently, as if afraid to disturb the fragile honesty of the moment. Then others joined, their claps stronger, firmer, rising like a tide. Soon the dining room pulsed with a swell of applause, not the polite kind reserved for performance, but the kind that grew from recognition, from humility, from awakening. Keanu bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement but did not bask in it. His calm expression remained the same as it had been all night, steady, humble, unmoved by spectacle. When the applause softened, Gordon Ramsay stepped forward. His arms were crossed, but his tone was resolute. "What happened tonight," he said, "will not be swept under the rug. Service is not just plates and polish, it is character. And when that standard is broken, we fix it. Right here, right now." Every server stiffened, waiting for his verdict. Chloe, trembling near the back wall, clutched her apron tightly. She looked pale, her confidence shattered, her eyes wet with tears she could no longer hide. Gordon turned his gaze directly on her, his voice cut sharp, yet controlled. "You're not fired. Not tonight, but you are off the floor." The room stirred, the unexpected words rippling through it. The entire restaurant froze at Gordon's declaration. Some staff exchanged glances of surprise, while others looked relieved that Chloe had not been dismissed outright. But Gordon wasn't finished. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Starting tomorrow," he said firmly, "you'll report to the dish pit. You'll scrub plates, scour pans, and clean the corners no one else wants to touch. You'll do it until your hands ache and your pride softens. Because humility doesn't come from serving champagne, it comes from serving without glory." The words landed heavy, but they weren't cruel. They carried the precision of a surgeon's cut, painful, yet meant to heal. Chloe's chin quivered. She pressed her trembling fingers against her apron as though clinging to something solid. Tears spilled freely now, glistening under the chandelier light. I understand, Chef," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't deserve to be here, but I'll earn it back. However long it takes, I'll earn it back." Her vow cracked the room open in a way no reprimand ever could. Guests shifted, some visibly moved. A woman in pearls dabbed her eyes with her napkin. The food bloggers at the side table sat wordless, their earlier cynicism washed away. Gordon gave a single nod, his jaw still tight, but his tone slightly gentler. Then prove it. Service isn't about image. It's about respect for the food, for the staff, and for every soul who walks through that door. Chloe lowered her head, tears dripping onto her uniform. But there was no defiance in her posture now, only a raw sincerity that hadn't been there before. She swallowed hard, then said again, louder this time, "I'll earn it back." The crowd fell into silence once more, but it was no longer the heavy silence of shame. It was a reflective one, softened by the recognition that even mistakes, when faced honestly, could become turning points. Keanu, who had remained silent through Gordon's words, glanced toward Chloe with a look that wasn't harsh but filled with quiet compassion. And in that glance was the unspoken reminder: dignity could still be chosen, even now. The applause did not resume immediately this time. Instead, the room sat in a kind of reverent quiet, letting Chloe's tears and Gordon's verdict linger in the air. Then, Charles Holloway, still holding his glass, raised it once more, this time not just for Keanu, but for the lesson unfolding before them. "Humility," he said softly, "is the rarest dish served in rooms like this. Tonight, we finally tasted it." The words unlocked the room again. A wave of applause followed, not directed solely at Keanu this time, but at the transformation everyone had witnessed. The clapping grew, filling every corner of Hell's Gold, until it became more than applause. It became a pledge to remember the moment, to carry it beyond the velvet ropes and chandeliers. Keanu gave only a faint nod, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. He wasn't basking in recognition, only steady, as if content simply to know the message had reached where it needed to. Gordon's expression softened slightly as he looked around his restaurant, his empire of fire and perfection suddenly lit by something more powerful than gold: truth. Chloe, still trembling, looked toward Keanu with eyes that no longer held arrogance, only gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice barely carried beyond the nearest table. Her vow to change wasn't just to Gordon anymore. It was to every guest, every server, and most of all, to herself. Keanu met her eyes, and in the smallest of nods, offered forgiveness without words. It was not a dismissal of her mistakes, but an invitation to start again. The staff began to disperse back into their duties, but the air was different now. Their steps were quieter, their eyes softer. Guests resumed their meals, but many paused between bites, reflecting more deeply on the weight of what they had seen. For in one evening, Hell's Gold had been stripped of its glitter and given something far more valuable, a lesson etched into every heart present. And for Chloe, the long road to humility had only just begun. The night had stretched long, but no one seemed ready to leave. Slowly, the glittering crowd of diners filtered out into the cool Beverly Hills air, their chauffeurs waiting with polished cars and engines humming like quiet thunder. The buzz of conversation trailed out with them, but it was not the gossip of food or celebrity anymore. It was something weightier, the kind of reflection people carried like a stone in their pocket. Inside Hell's Gold, the dining hall emptied until only the staff remained. Chandeliers still glowed overhead, but their shine felt softer now, as if humbled by the weight of what had happened. Servers stood in a loose circle, aprons creased, hands still holding pens or wine keys, their faces pale but attentive. At the center stood Gordon Ramsay, his chef's coat dusted faintly with flour and fire, and beside him, Keanu Reeves, the quiet man who had sat at the worst table and turned it into the most powerful seat in the house. Keanu looked around at them, not with judgment, but with the same calm patience he had carried all evening. When he spoke, his voice was steady, almost gentle, but it filled every corner of the room. "What happened here tonight wasn't about food," he began. "It wasn't about who could afford the beef Wellington or who could sit closest to the chandeliers. It was about something much simpler. It was about how we see each other." The staff shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes. Others stared at him, transfixed. "I know what pressure looks like," Keanu continued. "I've felt it. I've watched it crush good people. But pressure doesn't excuse prejudice. Stress doesn't give us permission to strip someone else of their dignity. And appearances," he paused, scanning the room, "are never a replacement for empathy." The words cut, not with anger, but with clarity, landing on every heart like a steady drum. He let the silence breathe before continuing. "Hospitality isn't about gold, plates, or chandeliers. It's about something so simple we often forget it. Making someone feel seen. That is the real craft. That is the soul of service." The room held its breath. Even Gordon, known for fire and fury, listened with quiet reverence. Keanu's eyes moved slowly from face to face, pausing on the youngest servers who clutched their notepads nervously, then on the older ones who had seen years of long nights and heavy trays. He wasn't lecturing. He was offering something gentler, a truth that came from experience rather than judgment. "You never know who walks through your door," he said softly. "It might be someone famous, or it might be someone forgotten. It might be a critic whose words can change a business. Or it might be a mother who worked 2 jobs just to afford one night out. What matters isn't who they are on the outside, it's how you make them feel while they're here." A hush followed. The words sank deep into the bones of the room, as though every corner of hell's gold had been waiting for them. Keanu stepped back slightly, letting his hand rest on the back of the same wobbly chair he had occupied earlier. "That table in the corner," he said, nodding toward it, "was supposed to be an insult, a reminder that I didn't belong. But I want you to remember something. It's not the table that defines the experience. It's the way you treat the person sitting at it. That's what people carry home. That's what they remember years later." Chloe, still standing near the wall with her apron crumpled in her hands, lowered her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. But this time, she wasn't the only one moved. Several staff members blinked hard, their own shame written across their faces. They had stood by and watched, and the realization stung. Keanu let the silence linger, then added, "Hospitality is not a performance. It's not about impressing someone into silence. It's about listening. It's about respect. And if you can offer that to everyone, regardless of their shoes, their clothes, their wallet, then you've done something that lasts longer than any meal." The staff breathed out slowly, as if the weight in the air had shifted. In that stillness, Gordon Ramsay finally stepped forward, his eyes hard but his voice lower than usual. Gordon folded his arms, his gaze moving from Keanu to the staff gathered around them. The fire in his eyes was still there, but it burned differently now, not as fury, but as conviction. "He's right," Gordon said, his voice firm and unmistakable. "You've all seen me scream in this kitchen, tear into someone for overcooking a scallop or sending out raw lamb. But what Keanu said just now," he shook his head slowly, "that hit harder than anything I've ever shouted." The room stayed silent, every set of eyes locked on him. "This restaurant was built on standards," Gordon continued. "Standards of excellence, standards of discipline. But tonight showed me something we've overlooked. Our standard cannot just be perfection on a plate. It has to be dignity for every guest, no matter what they look like when they walk in. Otherwise, we're nothing but a stage play, pretending to be hospitality." The staff shifted, the truth heavy, but undeniable. Even the dishwashers who had crept out from the back to listen stood straighter, their faces illuminated by the chandelier's fading glow. "This tonight," Gordon raised his hand slightly, sweeping it across the empty dining room, "is a turning point. I want every single one of you to remember it. We don't serve status here. We serve people. And if I ever see someone treated like they don't belong, whether they're a billionaire or a man off the street, you'll answer to me directly. Understood?" A collective murmur of "Yes, chef" filled the space, subdued but sincere. Keanu gave Gordon a quiet nod of gratitude, then let his gaze fall once more on the staff. "Pressure will always be there," he said gently. "But the choice is yours, whether you let that pressure harden you or remind you of what matters. Choose to see people, every time." His words lingered like incense in the air, seeping into the marble, the chandeliers, the very bones of hell's gold. And for the first time that night, the room felt less like a cathedral of ego and more like a place where humanity had finally been served. The night had reached its quiet end, Outside, the paparazzi had drifted away, their flashes gone, leaving the street in a hushed calm. Inside Hell's Gold, the once bustling dining room now stood nearly empty. The chandeliers still glimmered, their golden light falling softly across polished marble and velvet chairs, but the air had shifted. No longer heavy with ego or performance, it was lighter, now etched with humility. Keanu stood near the back, his hand resting briefly on the wobbly table that had been his place for the night. The chair, slightly uneven, no longer felt like an insult. It had transformed into something symbolic, a reminder that dignity could be found even in the dimmest corners. He slipped his faded jacket over his shoulder, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and adjusted the strap of his satchel. No grand exit, no dramatic farewell. Just the same quiet presence with which he had arrived. The staff watched him, not with disdain this time, but with a deep respect that words could not capture. Some exchanged glances, others lowered their heads, ashamed they had not seen what was in front of them sooner. Chloe, still clutching her apron, wiped her face with trembling hands. Her journey toward redemption had only just begun, but the first step was clear. She had been broken open, and now she had to rebuild. As Keanu walked toward the side door, Gordon Ramsay's voice rose firmly behind him, carrying across the room. "Remember this night," Gordon told his staff. "We're not just serving food here, we're serving character." His eyes scanned the faces of his team. "The plates will always matter, but the way we treat people, the way we see them, that's what defines us." Keanu paused briefly at the door, his head lowering in acknowledgement, then pushed it open and stepped into the night. No cameras followed, no spotlight shone. Yet for those inside, the imprint of his presence would not fade. The man who sat at the worst table had left behind the greatest lesson. The room remained still after Keanu's quiet departure. For a long moment, no one moved. The empty table in the corner stood as a silent witness, no longer the forgotten seat shoved near the utility station. Tonight, it had become a place of revelation, a place where arrogance had been dismantled and dignity restored. Servers glanced at it with a kind of reverence, as though it now carried its own weight, a reminder etched into the fabric of Hell's Gold. Gordon Ramsay stepped forward, his arms still folded but his voice calmer than the staff had ever heard it. "That corner table," he said, pointing toward the shadows, "is now part of this restaurant's history. It used to be the seat no one wanted, the seat given as punishment or an afterthought. After tonight, it's something else entirely. It's where truth Saturday." His words lingered, pressing into the hearts of those who listened. The staff shifted quietly, nodding, some whispering, "Yes, chef," under their breath. Even the dishwashers at the back, who had peeked out during the confrontation, stood straighter, sensing that they were part of something bigger than just polishing plates. Chloe remained at the edge of the group, her eyes red but clear. She had humiliated herself in front of everyone, but she also felt something stirring a chance to change, if she could embrace the humility the night had forced on her. She thought of Keanu's words, of Gordon's lesson, and promised herself that she would prove worthy of another chance, even if it meant starting at the very bottom. In the dining room, the tables gleamed under the softened glow of candles burning low. Diners had left hours earlier, with more than full stomachs. They carried with them a story, one that would ripple through social circles, articles, and whispers across the city. The night when status was stripped away and character was revealed in its rawest form. Hell's Gold was no longer just a temple of indulgence. It had become, in a single evening, a mirror, and everyone who had been their guest, critic, or staff would never forget what it showed them. When the last of the lights dimmed and only a soft glow lingered from the chandeliers, the staff finally dispersed, but the echoes of the night stayed behind. That table in the corner would never again be seen as a punishment seat. It was now a reminder, a marker of what happens when people are misjudged and of the humility that follows when truth is revealed. Charles Holloway, the critic, lingered a moment longer than the rest. He scribbled one last note into his leather-bound journal before sliding it into his pocket. His review would not just be about the food. It would be about the lesson that had been plated alongside it, a story more powerful than truffles or champagne. Chloe walked slowly past the table, running her fingers across its worn surface. She no longer saw it as shame, but as a challenge. Her journey toward redemption would start there, with the memory of the man who never once raised his voice, yet changed the entire room. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time, they were not born of humiliation. They were the first drops of resolve. Outside, Keanu Reeves walked into the cool night air, jacket slung casually over his shoulder, vanishing into the quiet streets without fanfare. His absence spoke louder than presence. He didn't stay for applause. He didn't linger for recognition. He left as he had come, unnoticed by most, unforgettable to those who had truly seen him. Back inside, Gordon gathered the remaining staff for one final reminder. His voice was steady, etched with conviction. "We are not just serving food here," he told them. "We are serving character. If we forget that, nothing we plate will ever matter." Heads bowed, and for the first time in a long time, the staff felt united not by fear, but by respect. That night, Hell's Gold shifted, forever. Diners left changed, the staff humbled, and Chloe prepared to rebuild herself. And, in the corner of that grand restaurant, the smallest table carried the greatest weight. If you believe respect should never depend on status, comment yes below and share this incredible story.